So I'm Brian Romm. I do habitat management and restoration work with the Georgia DNR botany team, mostly focused on rare plants and threatened natural communities. A good bit of fire management, a little bit of interacting with private landowners, doing consulting and stuff like that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about fire and its role in Georgia's natural history, just to kind of provide a background and some context for what the other speakers are going to talk about. So quick overview of Georgia's natural communities. Georgia is one of the most biodiverse states in the entire country. We're top 5 or 6, pretty easy, right behind California, Texas, and Florida. And it's a function of a lot of different factors. We have a pretty complex geology, a lot of different soil types, a lot of different topographies and hydrologies. We have a favorable climate, which lends itself to higher biodiversity. And we have a lot of different ecological drivers like fire and historically large grazing mammals, resulting in several different natural communities across the entire state, leading to very high species richness. And a big part of that is kind of the way macro communities and micro communities work together. So when we talk about macro communities, we're talking about, like, here would be your longleaf pine savanna, and your embedded communities would be your depression ponds, your glades, your rock outcrops, your pitcher plant bogs and stuff like that. And again, Georgia is a fire adapted landscape from top to bottom. Plant communities require fire as a mechanism to maintain those open conditions, to maintain herbaceous diversity, prevent hardwood encroachment and stuff like that, that would otherwise reduce species richness and impact the wildlife that depend on those plant communities. So this is just a good map showing all the different geologies of Georgia, kind of the underlying basis for the diversity statewide. You know, we're down here in the coastal plain on the fringe of the sandhills, and you get up into the Piedmont Mountains, and there's just a lot of different stuff going on. So this is a great resource. You can find it online. So we're talking about fire management and managing habitats in general. It's good to think about Georgia's pre-human landscape. So what was going on here before people showed up? And again, going back to those fire adapted communities, Georgia's landscape has been fire adapted for a long time, since well before people showed up and started burning it. And a lot of those ecosystems exist because of frequent fires, keeping that open canopy, keeping sunlight on the ground, driving those diverse plant communities. And a lot of Georgia would have had a fire return interval of less than 5 years. You get down here, it's a little closer to 2 years. Historically, would have had much larger fire compartments. You know, take away the cities, take away the roads, take away the big highways. You're talking about huge chunks of land that would have been receptive for fire to spread without much able to stop it until it hits, you know, kind of a natural fire break like a river or bigger creek or rock outcrops or something like that. We would have had more widespread receptive fuels. Historically, the landscape would have been a lot more open, a lot less forest cover. There would have been a lot more graminoid and herbaceous fuels for fire to carry through. So you're talking about big fire compartments with receptive fuels. And then most importantly, is your natural mechanism. So what would have historically started these fires before people showed up? And the most obvious answer is lightning strike. So you're talking about an area with pretty frequent lightning strikes. Y'all have been here through spring and summer. You've heard it, with big fire compartments, receptive fuels, a lot of fire on the ground covering pretty big areas. And then there's seasonality implications for when is lightning hitting the ground? When would these fires have been occurring naturally? So this is a map that y'all might have seen coming in. Marinelle's got it set up on the fire exchange table. This is predicted historic fire frequency for the United States. And as you can see in the Southeast where we are, it's in that 2 to 4 year bubble for most of the state, getting closer to 2 years as you get further south. So a lot of fire going on historically. This map is just to kind of illustrate what I was talking about with those larger fire compartments. This wouldn't necessarily been what would have burned, but when you're talking about, you know, what's going to stop a lightning strike fire that hits, you're talking about larger waterways. So this kind of helps to illustrate, you know, what kind of landscape would have been burning before we showed up and put roads and cities and all that stuff out there. This is a lightning strike frequency map across the country showing surface lightning strikes, and Georgia's not quite as yellow as places like Texas and South Florida, but still quite a lot of lightning hitting the ground. And again, when you're talking about those big fire compartments with receptive fuels, you only need one lightning strike and you're going to have a pretty substantial landscape level fire. And then getting into seasonality, there's some outliers on the sides where, the Midwest is doing weird stuff in October, but most of the lightning strikes in the United States fall between May and mid-September, and Georgia kind of fits right in the middle of that as well. So getting back to more habitat management stuff, what are we doing when we're burning? We're trying to replicate historic conditions. We're trying to provide a set of circumstances that lets these ecosystems do what they're supposed to do naturally. So how do we best replicate that? And what I came up with was creating larger fire compartments where possible. So bigger burn units when you're able to. And quick note on this is all comfort zone. I'm not telling y'all to go out and do all this stuff. This is definitely, do what you're comfortable with doing, or none of it, it's up to y'all. So bigger burn units allows for more natural fire behavior. It allows you to hit those embedded communities, those wetlands, those rock outcrops and stuff like that within your bigger landscape. Letting fire reach into wetlands and bottoms. These systems would have been connected to the landscape. The fire wouldn't have just magically not touched them. So it's really important, especially in those transition zones, for maintaining habitat, for maintaining biodiversity, to let fire get down into some of these wetter areas where it's safe and applicable. Utilizing different firing techniques. So one of Shan's terms, biodiversity, is changing up your ignition patterns, letting fire kind of do what it's going to do, let it back where it wants to back, let it get into a wet area and burn where it's going to burn. And, sometimes you have to get a little bit hotter to reach objectives. And then the big one that we're going to talk about for the most of the day is burning during the growing season or the lightning season to replicate those historic conditions. So some benefits of growing season burning: promoting herbaceous diversity is probably the biggest benefit to wildlife that you're going to have. There's a greater impact on the shrub and hardwood components, keeping things open. Increased forb diversity tied to forage quality and insect diversity. You put more plant diversity out there, there's more options for critters to eat. More plants out there also means more insects. So for wildlife that require insects to live or raise their young, it's pretty important. And reducing graminoid competition is a big one. Not saying that it's going to hurt the grass necessarily, but it's going to allow for a little bit more heterogeneity on the landscape. You can see that picture on the top right is a good example of what you see when you're able to knock back some of that grass component and let forbs and wildflowers come in. Burning during the growing season, it's ecologically appropriate, and it's usually better burn conditions for a lot of embedded communities, especially when you're talking about kind of those isolated wetlands and stuff. You get into hydro period, they tend to be a lot drier during the growing season and a lot more receptive to fire. So if you're trying to get fire to those systems, it's a good time of year to do it. And some plants require growing season fire to reproduce. Wiregrass is a big one. It requires late spring, summer fire to flower and go to seed. And there's other, plant indicators as well, like longleaf pine. The candles harden, pretty close to lightning season. I don't think that's a coincidence. What else? And then another one is it helps expand your burn window. So beyond those dormant season months, being open to growing season burning allows you to get more fire on the ground. It lets you be more flexible with your planning. And changing up those fire effects and intensity is also pretty helpful. So kind of a quick overview. That's almost all I got. So Georgia's an incredibly diverse state. We have a ton of different natural communities. A lot of those are, oriented within a larger landscape where you have a macro setting like your longleaf pine savanna with smaller communities embedded within, and getting fire through those is incredibly important for landscape diversity. Thinking about the pre-human landscape, those frequent lightning caused fires and bigger fire compartments with more receptive fuels. We're trying to replicate natural fire conditions with bigger burn units, diversifying fire intensity, appropriate seasonality, and all that when it's applicable. And then we just went through some of the benefits of growing season fire. Pitcher plants are a pretty good example of some of those embedded wetland communities that greatly benefit from fire being on the landscape. And then lastly, a lot of folks like to talk about gopher tortoises. I like to talk about gopher tortoises. A good growing season burn means a lot of fresh greens on the ground for little baby gopher tortoises coming out to munch on. So that's pretty much all I got. If anyone's got questions for me, I'm out in social circle. All right.